The pallet jack jerked hard to the left, nearly crushing Richard's foot. He yanked it back just in time, heart jumping, breath caught somewhere in his throat. The load wobbled, then settled. Boxes of cleaning supplies. Heavy. Cheap. Replaceable. Just like him, a voice in his head whispered before he could stop it. Richard stood still for a second in the middle of the warehouse aisle, fluorescent lights buzzing overhead. Sweat slid down his spine even though the morning shift had barely started. Around him, forklifts beeped, metal clanged, life kept moving with no interest in whether he was ready. Easy, he muttered, more to himself than the machine. 56 years old. 2 decades in this building. And still one bad step away from being done. He pushed the pallet forward again, slower now. Careful. Richard had always been careful. That was the thing people liked about him. Dependable. Steady. The guy who covered shifts, who stayed late, who never complained when schedules changed last minute. The guy who never asked for much. His phone vibrated in his pocket. Richard ignored it. Phones meant problems these days. Bills. Appointments. Conversations that started calm and ended with someone staring at the floor. He finished the aisle, parked the pallet, wiped his hands on his jeans. The phone buzzed again. He checked it this time. Patricia, call me when you can. No explanation. That tightened something in his chest. Richard glanced at the clock. 15 minutes until break. He nodded at a younger coworker as he passed, forced a small smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. In the break room, he poured himself coffee that tasted faintly of burned plastic and sat down at the same table he always used. The chair creaked under his weight. Another small reminder. He called Patricia. Hey, he said. What's going on? Her voice came through soft, careful. Are you sitting down? Richard closed his eyes. That phrase. It always came before something you couldn't undo. I'm at work, he said. Just tell me. There was a pause. Not long. Just long enough. The letter came, Patricia said. Richard's grip tightened around the paper cup. Which letter? The medical one. From the insurance. The warehouse noise faded into a dull hum. Richard stared at the scuffed tabletop, at someone's initials carved years ago and never fixed. And, he asked. They won't cover the rest, Patricia said. Not unless we appeal. And even then. She didn't finish. Richard already knew the shape of the ending. I'll pick up overtime, he said immediately. I can talk to Mike. Maybe weekends. Richard. I'm fine, he cut in gently. I can handle more. Silence pressed against his ear. Then Patricia spoke again, quieter now. It's not just about money. Richard swallowed. He had spent his whole life believing that if he kept showing up, if he stayed generous, mellow, reliable, life would eventually ease its grip. But sitting there in the break room, coffee going cold in his hands, Richard felt a different truth begin to surface. Sometimes life didn't tighten because you were weak. Sometimes it tightened because you were running out of room. Outside, a forklift beeped sharply. Richard stood up before the brake bell rang. Somewhere deep inside him, a question he had avoided for years finally pushed its way forward. What happens when being dependable isn't enough anymore? And this time, he didn't push it away. Richard got home just after sunset. The house was quiet except for the low hum of the ceiling fan and the slow thump of Duke's tail against the floor when Richard stepped inside. The dog stood, stretched, and padded over, pressing his weight into Richard's legs like he always did, solid, unquestioning. Hey, boy, Richard murmured, scratching behind his ears. Duke sighed, satisfied. Patricia was at the kitchen table. Not cooking. Not watching TV. Just sitting there with a stack of papers spread neatly in front of her, edges aligned too carefully. That was how Richard knew she'd been waiting. You didn't answer my text, she said. I was moving pallets, Richard replied, setting his keys down. "What's all this?" Patricia slid the papers toward him. "Insurance statements. Itemized charges. Numbers circled in pen." "They approved part of it," she said. "But not the rest. They say it's out of scope." Richard stared at the page. His eyes went straight to the total at the bottom. "I can fix this," he said immediately. "I'll take doubles. Nights. Whatever they need." Patricia's jaw tightened. "That's what you always say." He looked up at her then. "Because it's what I can do." "And when your back finally gives out?" she asked. "When they replace you with someone half your age who costs less?" Richard didn't answer. He didn't know how to answer without admitting something he wasn't ready to say out loud. Patricia leaned back in her chair, rubbing her temples. "Alex called today. That landed differently." "How is he?" Richard asked. "Fine," she said. "Too fine." He asked if we needed help. Richard felt heat rise in his chest. "We don't. He's our son, Richard. He's trying to build his life," Richard snapped, then softened his voice. "I won't be the reason it slows down." Patricia studied him. "You already are," she said gently. "Just not the way you think." Duke wandered over and lay down at Richard's feet, resting his chin on his boot. Richard stared at the dog, at the gray starting to creep into his fur. "How much time do we have?" he asked quietly. Patricia hesitated. "Not much." Later that night, Richard stood alone in the garage, the door half open to let the heat out. He picked up an old toolbox and set it down again without opening it. Inside were tools he hadn't needed in years, things he kept because letting go felt like admitting something had ended. He leaned against the workbench and closed his eyes. For the first time, the thought came clearly, without panic or drama. "I can't outwork this." The realization didn't break him. It scared him because it felt true. And somewhere in the quiet, another question followed, one he had never allowed himself to ask. "If work can't save me, what can?" The call came 3 days later, right in the middle of Richard's shift. He was unloading a truck when his supervisor waved him over, face unreadable. Richard wiped his hands on his jeans and followed, every step heavier than the last. "Office line," the man said. "Says it's personal." Richard felt it before he heard it. He answered. "This is Richard." "Mr. Martinez?" a woman asked. Her voice was calm, professional. "This is Rosa Alvarez from HR." HR. That word carried weight in a place like this. "Yes," Richard said. "We're doing a routine review," she continued. "Age, tenure, physical strain. You've been here a long time." 22 years, Richard thought. "We wanted to discuss options," Rosa said. "Light-duty reassignment. Fewer hours. Possibly early retirement." Richard closed his eyes for half a second. "And the pay?" he asked. Another pause. "Adjusted," she said. That was all it took. "Thank you for letting me know," Richard replied. Polite. Automatic. He hung up and stood there, the warehouse noise crashing back into him all at once. Light duty meant less money. Early retirement meant no chance to recover. It meant the math no longer worked. That night, Richard didn't tell Patricia about the call. Not yet. Instead, he took Duke for a long walk through the neighborhood, the Texas heat finally easing as the sun dipped low. Houses glowed softly behind curtains. Somewhere, a radio played old music. Richard walked slowly, feeling every step. He thought about the day Alex was born. How small his hand had been. How heavy the responsibility felt, and how right. He had promised then that his son would never have to worry about things like this. At home, Richard sat alone in the garage, the door open, air thick and still. He pulled a small metal box from the back shelf and set it on the workbench. Inside was an envelope. Old. Yellowed. Emergency savings. Not much. Never enough. He'd added to it when he could, told himself it was for real trouble. This was real trouble. If he used it now, they could cover the medical gap. Maybe by time. But once it was gone, it was gone. Richard rested his hands on the bench and bowed his head. He didn't pray often. Hadn't in years. Not because he didn't believe, but because asking felt selfish. Tonight, he whispered anyway. I don't need a miracle, he said quietly. I just need to know what I'm supposed to do. Duke sat beside him, silent, steady. No answer came. But for the first time, Richard didn't feel completely alone in the question. And that scared him almost as much as it comforted him. Richard found the envelope by accident. It was buried in a box labeled tax stuff, shoved behind old manuals and a broken drill he'd meant to throw out years ago. He was looking for receipts, anything he could use to strengthen the insurance appeal, when the envelope slid free and landed on the concrete floor. No return address. His name, written by hand. He stared at it longer than necessary before picking it up. Inside was a folded letter and a photocopy of a check stub dated nearly 8 years back. Warehouse logo at the top. His employee ID number printed clean and official. Richard's brow furrowed. He read the letter once. Then again, slower. It was from payroll. An internal notice explaining a misclassification during a system transition, temporary role coded incorrectly, overtime not fully credited for several months. The letter said a reconciliation would be processed in a future cycle. A future cycle that never came. The total owed sat at the bottom. Richard had to sit down. It wasn't life-changing money. It wasn't miraculous. But it was real. And it was enough to change the immediate shape of things. Enough to cover the medical gap. Enough to avoid touching the emergency fund. Enough to breathe. His phone buzzed. Alex, Dad, you okay? Mom sounded worried. Richard swallowed. I found something, he said. I think it helps. That night, Richard laid everything out on the kitchen table. The letter. The stub. The math. Patricia read silently, lips moving slightly as she recalculated the numbers on her own. You never followed up? She asked. Richard shook his head. Didn't want to make trouble. Patricia closed her eyes. Just for a second. Then she reached across the table and took his hand. You've been paying for that choice ever since, she said gently. The next day, Richard went to HR in person. No anger. No accusations. Just facts, documents, and the calm steadiness that had defined his whole career. Rosa listened. Checked records. Made a call. Her eyebrows lifted. This should have been resolved years ago, she said. I'm sorry. The correction processed faster than Richard expected. Direct deposit. Clean. Official. When he told Patricia, she cried. Not loudly. Just quietly, like something long held had finally loosened. Richard sat on the back step that evening with Duke beside him, the Texas sky burning orange and pink. The pressure in his chest hadn't vanished. But it had shifted. For the first time, the future didn't feel like a wall. It felt like a door, still heavy, still uncertain, but no longer locked. Richard didn't quit his job. At least, not right away. The money arrived quietly, deposited without fanfare, the numbers on the screen changing like they always had. No announcement. No relief loud enough to hear. Just space. Enough space to breathe without counting every inhale. He kept going to work. Showed up early. Stayed late when asked. Not because he was afraid anymore, but because he wanted to leave on his own terms, not because his body or the numbers forced him out. Patricia noticed the difference first. You're not carrying it the same way, she said one evening as they sat on the porch, Duke stretched out at their feet. Whatever it was, it loosened. Richard nodded. I stopped thinking one mistake would end everything. They finished the insurance appeal. Covered the bills. No debt. No emergency fund drained down to nothing. Just balance, fragile, imperfect, but real. When Richard finally told Alex the full story, his son went quiet on the phone. "You should have told me sooner," Alex said. "I know," Richard replied. "I just wanted to be your dad. Not your problem." Alex exhaled. "You've always been both. And that's okay." That night, Richard stood alone in the garage, the same place where fear had settled into his bones weeks earlier. He opened the metal box, looked at the emergency envelope inside, and then closed it again, untouched. Some things, he realized, were meant to exist only so you knew they were there. On his last full shift, Richard clocked out and paused by the warehouse doors. He rested his hand on the cool metal for a moment, feeling the vibration of work still humming inside the building. 22 years. Not wasted. Just given. At home, Patricia hugged him without saying anything. Duke wagged himself into a frenzy. The house felt warmer than it had in months. Later, as the sun dropped low over San Antonio, Richard sat on the porch and watched the light fade. He thought about the man he'd been, dependable, generous, mellow. About how those things had nearly cost him everything. And about how they'd also saved him, because he'd stayed steady long enough to notice the door when it finally opened. Faith, he understood now, hadn't been about waiting for rescue. It had been about not giving up his ground before the answer arrived. Richard Martinez didn't feel rich. He felt finished. Finished running. Finished being afraid. And for the first time in a long while, that felt like enough.